morning is a collection of readings from Genesis chapter 39 through 41. I will read some, and then I will summarize for you, and then I will read some. This is from Genesis chapter 39. Joseph's master Potiphar took him and threw him in jail, the place where the king's prisoners were held. And while he was in jail, the Lord was with Joseph and remained loyal to him. He caused the jail's commander to think highly of Joseph, and the jail's commander put all of the prisoners in the jail under Joseph's supervision, and he was the one who determined everything that happened there. The jail's commander paid no attention to anything under Joseph's supervision because the Lord was with him and made everything he did successful. Sometime later, though, this is chapter 40, both the wine steward and the baker for Egypt's king offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief wine steward and the chief baker, and he put them under arrest with the commander of the royal guard in the same jail where Joseph was imprisoned. The commander of the royal guard assigned Joseph to assist them. Now, in this next portion of Scripture, both the baker and the chief wine steward have dreams. If you remember earlier from the story of Joseph, Joseph interprets dreams, or God interprets them through Joseph. The baker has a dream, the wine steward has a dream, and no one can interpret them except Joseph. When it comes to the wine steward, he says to him, "This is the dream's interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. After 3 days, the Pharaoh will give you an audience and return you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just the way things were before when you were the wine steward. But please, remember me when you are doing well, and be loyal to me. Put in a good word for me to Pharaoh, so he will set me free from this prison. I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here too I've done nothing to be thrown into this dungeon." But the chief wine steward didn't remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. And 2 years later, the Pharaoh had a dream that he was standing on the Nile. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. During his imprisonment by the Nazis in the 1940s, the German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote to his friends and family. Those letters are collected, and they include not only personal recollections, but his reflections on church and God, written before he was executed at a concentration camp. You can read all those letters. They're collected in a volume called Letters and Papers from Prison, and I encourage you to read it. But in an eerie foreshadowing of his impending imprisonment, before he was arrested, Bonhoeffer wrote this: "Because time is the most precious gift at our disposal, being of all the gifts the most irretrievable, the thought of time possibly lost disturbs us whenever we look back." We are all haunted, are we not, by the thought of lost time? And because of that, the idea of patience as a virtue seems actually a bit wasteful. How can we bear to be patient when the non-renewable resource of time is sifting through our fingers like sand? I just had a baby yesterday, and now he's going into the 1st grade. Even worse, though, than regular time marching on ahead of us is the idea of time stolen, like it was for Bonhoeffer. How can we bear patiently when our time is taken from us unjustly? This morning, we find ourselves smack dab in the middle of the story of Joseph after he has been sold into slavery by his brothers and before he ascends to power, becoming the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Joseph now is languishing in prison, falsely accused of the sexual assault of his master's wife. And he has been imprisoned for at least the 2 years that the text tells us. But his incarceration may have been even longer. I often wonder, was Joseph in agony for those years? I wonder if he raged or he prayed angry psalms to God. I wonder when time is stolen. When time is stolen, is patience even godly? My familiarity with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is barely passable. I'll admit that. I have very sketchy recollections of brief units in history classes dedicated to the topic. But recent strife in our country post-Ferguson has left me scrambling to better understand the shape of the world, because I realized it's not shaped like I thought. Only now, as an adult, am I actually reading James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. instead of having them quoted at me. And it is shattering to realize words written 50 years ago still strike at the heart of what we are doing today. At the time, Anglo clergy were asking their African American brothers and sisters to wait, to bear patiently, still longer, under a yoke of segregation and inequality. But during his imprisonment in a Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an impassioned letter to those same brother clergy saying, "For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the air of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. But there comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." Patience they were being asked to show was not actually patience at all. They were being asked to be complicit in continued and unabated injustice against themselves. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was unjustly imprisoned by Nazis, and he struggled against the same strange word and what its definition possibly could actually mean. In one of the letters to his parents, he wrote, "One of my predecessors scribbled above the cell door, 'In 100 years, everything will be over.'" It was his attempt to cope with this experience of empty time. There is much to be said about this. "My times are in your hand," Psalm 31, is a biblical answer to this question, but the Bible also contains the question that threatens to dominate everything here. Lord, how long? To their faith, Martin's and Dietrich's really demand that they patiently endure wrongful imprisonment and injustice in silence? Our scripture tells the story of a man wrongly imprisoned. Though Joseph has gained the favor of the jailer and become a leader in the prison itself, he is still in prison for a crime he did not commit. Now remember, Joseph is in his late teens, probably 17, when his brothers sell him into slavery. We do not know how long he was in the possession of slavers before he comes into the house of Potiphar. We are not sure how long he is a servant in Potiphar's house before he is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and taken into custody. What we do know is that Joseph did not ascend to power until he was 30. So it is possible that Joseph was wrongly imprisoned for as long as a decade. However long, though, he has been in prison, he is desperate to get out. Remember that when he meets the chief wine steward of the Pharaoh in the prison and interprets his dream for him, he makes this heartbreaking plea. Please, remember me when you are doing well and be loyal to me. Put in a good word for me to the Pharaoh and set me free from this prison. I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and hereto I have done nothing to be thrown into this dungeon. And the response? The next verse is sharp. But the chief wine steward did not remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. And 2 years later, the Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing in the Nile. Can you imagine that kind of grief? The kind of hopelessness? Would you dare tell Joseph to be patient with all the injustice in his life? Well, he keenly trusts in God's power and presence, but still. Who of you could face Joseph in his prison cell after years of abuse, the betrayal of his family, and say, just be patient? Joseph obviously does not accept his present state. He pleads to be released from it. So is he still faithful? Is his attempt to find release impatient? Does that mean it's ungodly? I don't think so. While the women and men that Joseph interacts with roundly fail him in every possible regard, God does not. There was a verse in chapter 39 that catches my breath. While he was in jail, the Lord was with Joseph and remained loyal to him. Joseph's brothers abused and forgot him. Potiphar jailed and forgot him. The cupbearer used and forgot him. But God remained with Joseph and was loyal to him. In verse 23, it's reiterated again, the Lord was with him and made everything he did successful. When Joseph interprets the dreams of the baker and the wine steward of the Pharaoh himself, he gives credit to God rather than lifting himself up. He knows the desires of God. He knows what God is planning. Joseph knows he's supposed to be an important participant in what God is going to do for the people of Israel and Egypt. He had no patience for the injustice he suffered under. And he should have had no patience for it. What he does patiently is to carry out God's will. His patience is made manifest in his trust in God's plan and his willing and dogged participation in it. Like the patriarchs of old, Noah and Abraham, he uncompromisingly gives himself over, patiently serves the living God no matter the circumstance. Maybe he had the patience to serve God's will because God has been the only one to be with him through everything. Perhaps the power to wait for the completion of God's plan was the knowledge that God was actually suffering with him. When Martin Luther King wrote in that prison cell in Birmingham, Alabama, he wrote, "Time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always right to do what is right." Like Joseph, Martin Luther King Jr. knew the right thing wouldn't happen because it should. Justice only comes through the patient work of the individual aligned with God, men and women on behalf of God. Righteous patience wasn't expressed by merely meekly accepting injustice upon thyself, Righteous patience was and is best expressed by the one who is committed to the long and oftentimes arduous process of bringing God's kingdom to the earth. While Bonhoeffer waited in a prison cell, he wrote, "We must now simply let go of what we cannot accomplish and confine ourselves to what we can do and should do, namely be strong in the midst of suffering, trusting confidently in God." The patience that we are called to exhibit as Christians is never complicity with injustice. We are never called to be the jailers who claim that the marginalized and minority communities should just accept their fate until justice magically rolls around. We are never allowed to be the chief wine stewards of Pharaoh who forget about those who are unjustly imprisoned, who neglect our responsibility to remember and speak up for those who have been made victims of corrupt systems. If anything, we are called to be like God. Like God is in the story of Joseph, to remain with, to be loyal to those who are struggling against what Paul called the powers and principalities of our age. The patience we are called to is God's patience. We will see through what God wills. We will see through God's righteous plans for justice. We will see them through, no matter if jail cells swallow us or hangmen stand in front of us. It's the patience of suffragettes and trans activists and the new civil rights movements. It's the patience of martyrs who die at the hand of ISIS. It's the patience of Bible translators who learn and develop written languages for people groups so small as to be unimportant. We are called to patience that defies injustice, not rolls over to it. That was Joseph's patience. That's what Martin Luther King's patience was. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer's patience was. That's what Nelson Mandela's patience was. 27 years in jail, still working for justice for his people. It's the patience of Jesus on a cross. And it's our patience too. So to answer, I guess, my own question from earlier, when time is short, when time is even stolen from us, is patience godly? Yes. Because patience is not a bludgeoning tool used to continue to oppress God's people. Patience is the will to wholeheartedly pursue God's righteousness and God's justice, no matter how long it takes, no matter if we see the day of justice come or die before it arrives. Because like Dr. King said, the time is always ripe to do what is right. Pray with me.